Hour Zero. As strategy rooms in Washington and Beijing light up with new intelligence, the real power may lie outside their control. AI-driven defense systems are granted partial autonomy, handling drone swarms, tracking hypersonic weapons, and launching counterstrikes in narrow, time-sensitive tasks. Human leaders still set objectives and rules of engagement, but the algorithms act faster than any officer can react. A fraction of a second gained by one side could mean the first successful intercept or a devastating breakthrough. The generals press forward, aware that the opening moves will come not from guns or missiles, but something less visible. Hour 1. Cyber Shadows. Hour 1. The conflict shifts into cyberspace. Outages spread, not from missiles or bombs, but from keystrokes deep inside secure bunkers. Across the Pacific, civilian energy grids tied to decades-old software begin flickering. Flight paths freeze midair as air traffic controllers suddenly lose radar feeds, and long-reliable satellite channels start producing scrambled signals. For ordinary people, it looks like a blackout without warning. For military command centers, the pattern is unmistakable. This is the opening blow of the digital campaign. Inside China, cyber units that are trained for years in guarded facilities now move to live operations. These are not isolated actors, but state-backed groups working with full logistical support, striking in coordinated waves. Some operations achieve significant disruption, but many others meet hardened barriers put in place since 2023. US networks reinforced by new defenses and supply chain patching efforts. Where cracks remain, Beijing's teams push aggressively, particularly against newer encryption layers still in uneven deployment. They probe the seams of early post-quantum systems, knowing that parts of the technology remain immature in 2025. Breaking even a handful of nodes would fracture real-time traffic, warping command orders before weapons are moved into position. The first alarms in Washington do not come from defense networks, but civilian infrastructure. Reports filter in from Hawaii as regional utilities warn of cascading failures across their systems. Hospital generators cut on as neighborhoods fall dark for minutes at a time. Grid engineers notice strange surges, apparently triggered by commands entered remotely from beyond their networks. Within minutes, word travels upward. This is no technical mishap. It carries a hostile signature. US Cyber Command and the NSA quickly execute contingency playbooks they had updated after earlier global cyber incidents. Intelligence had long flagged vulnerabilities across transport, energy, and finance. What takes American analysts by surprise is the breadth of the assault. Instead of one domain collapsing in isolation, multiple sectors show strain at once. Radars stutter intermittently, leaving pilots uncertain if their readings are accurate. Satellites and missile defenses show stress as feeds scramble, but redundancy, especially proliferated commercial backups, buys time and space for decisions. In Beijing, offensive teams keep up pressure, aiming not only to annoy but to paralyze. If orders cannot travel with confidence, then carriers at sea cannot launch aircraft, missile batteries hesitate, and logistics networks stall out. A short window of confusion can waste irreplaceable time downstream. This is the logic of digital-era war. Delay an opponent's response until their choices evaporate. Quantum-related efforts remain the most carefully watched. Neither Beijing nor Washington holds operational quantum decryption, but both understand the future risks. For now, the contest revolves around newly rolled out post-quantum protections. While stronger than past systems, deployment has been uneven, leaving some communication traffic exposed. Chinese teams focus on those weak edges, but success is patchy, blunted by US redundancy investments since 2023. Critical streams stay intact, even as specific nodes fall under pressure. Despite defenses, visible costs accumulate during this first hour. Regional outages across Hawaii and Guam disrupt traffic lights and shut down sections of the power grid. Automated shipping ports lock into fail-safe mode, freezing cranes with containers halfway suspended. Thousands of civilians see only inexplicable shutdowns. Military analysts, however, view the disruptions as coordinated pressure tactics tailored to slow America's forward response. Inside U.S. command posts, tension builds around trust. Administrators sift through garbled reports, unsure which systems remain uncompromised. Secure email chains time out, and command centers activate pre-scripted fallbacks rather than risking real identities. Junior officers debate whether to act in local judgment or hold for verified directions. Every delay weakens cohesion, while every independent move risks misfire in a contested battle space. The psychological effect of second-guessing rivals the technical one. NSA monitoring flaws grow frantic. Red dots sprawl across maps of national infrastructure, some linked to defense contractors, others to civilian aviation or port operators essential to wartime logistics. Officers call confirmations while coders counterattack with scripts written on the spot. America's volumetric defenses hold off total collapse, but maintaining situational clarity amid shifting alerts proves difficult. Chinese networks report mixed outcomes. Attack penetration succeeds in disrupting energy flows and commercial operations, but unexpected US mitigations, cloud redundancy, commercial satellite reroutes, and resilient message chains rehearsed since 2023 interfere with Beijing's plan for a seamless blackout. Some arms of America's Pacific Command remain cut off, but others restore connectivity within minutes through alternate tracks. Total paralysis proves elusive, forcing Chinese units to adapt on the fly. For the population scattered across Hawaii, Guam, and the broader Pacific, confusion deepens. Lights cut out in neighborhoods, bank apps crash, and port schedules stall. Families blame storms or earthquakes while analysts in Washington chart the attack as the largest coordinated cyber strike attempted against the United States. Those on the ground have no idea they are part of the opening hour of a major power conflict. By the end of the first hour, neither side has imposed decisive dominance. China achieves its aim of throwing US commands into temporary disorder, clouding visibility and halting movement in critical spaces. But America's investment in multi-layered resilience, spread across commercial satellites, redundant servers, and pre-built fallback procedures, blunts the worst damage. Outages and delays persist, but operational control never disappears fully. The digital offensive opens the war, but does not finish it. Still, the stakes have shifted. Tested systems strain under real fire. In Washington, the question is no longer whether networks can bend under pressure, they already have, but whether physical forces in the Pacific can carry on under imperfect command and faltering data. As the cyber fronts continue to pulse, the next phase of action begins to form elsewhere, in dimensions harder to hide and much more lethal. Hour 3, first hypersonic barrage. Hour 3. The next stage does not arrive as a hidden code or silent blackout, but as metal in the sky. From deep inside China, launch crews release a wave of hypersonic glide vehicles, intermediate to long-range systems designed to threaten distant American bases in ways older missiles never could. Once their boosters fall away, the weapons flatten into the atmosphere, accelerating to speeds beyond Mach 5. At those velocities, minutes stretch shorter than decision cycles. The trajectories tilt toward Guam, Okinawa, and Hawaii, key anchors of America's Pacific posture. Blunting their capabilities, even temporarily, could shift the balance in a single morning. These weapons differ sharply from traditional ballistic missiles. Older systems climb high into space and arc back to predictable endpoints. Hypersonics instead skim the atmosphere with abrupt shifts and maneuvering flight paths. That motion frustrates legacy tracking methods. Traditional ballistic defense predictions, which work against missiles following fixed parabolas, struggle with this unpredictability. US radar stations on land can see the launches, but cannot chart reliable paths in real time. Instead, missile warning depends on space-based infrared arrays. Heat signatures flare in orbiting sensors, prompting projected lines to ripple across Pacific maps in control rooms. The alerts confirm danger, but reveal only approximations. At sea, US destroyers and cruisers preparing to intercept initiate combat software. Aegis systems launch interceptors the moment trajectories lock into plausible zones, but accuracy is probabilistic at best. Each time the hypersonics dip or swerve, targeting probabilities shift drastically. Algorithms update second by second, redistributing interceptors in a constant race to guess where the glide path may tilt next. Sailors on watch can only monitor the probabilities shifting with unnerving speed, knowing that success hinges on fractions of seconds. The United States still possesses multiple layers of missile defense: ground-based interceptors, Aegis-equipped vessels, THAAD launchers, and Patriot batteries positioned to protect forward bases. Their effectiveness remains contested, depending on launch geometry, distance, and warning time. Against maneuvering hypersonics, these defenses are far from useless, but they operate on razor-thin margins. Partial protection, not certainty, defines this exchange. Offshore Guam, several interceptors meet their targets in blinding bursts. Operators confirm 3 glide vehicles destroyed, yet others break through. Within moments, a sequence of detonations rumbles across the island. One erupts beside hangars, setting aircraft ablaze. Another dismembers fuel depots, flames visible against the coastline. A final strike tears into runways, gouging deep craters that halt bomber launches already queued. In minutes, Guam shifts from an operational hub to a facility under crisis. Crews scrambling through smoke with fire trucks, medics evacuating the wounded, engineers hastily sketching repair routes, though repairable surfaces stretch across kilometers. Okinawa's defenses coordinate better. Patriot batteries, tied into naval radar, succeed in breaking apart most inbound threats. Yet one glide vehicle pierces through, hitting logistics warehouses critical for transporting supplies to carriers. The blast removes crates of munitions and materiel that cannot be instantly replaced. The damage appears limited in scale, but its significance is time. Operational momentum for resupplying forward-deployed fleets is blunted. Hawaii, further afield, benefits from longer warning intervals. Pearl Harbor's naval radars cue fresh intercept attempts. Improved software inside a newly upgraded destroyer learns to anticipate a sudden glide swerve and intercepts one missile outright. Another loses stability under nearby countermeasure detonations before hitting the target. The defenders cheer momentarily, but not all succeed. 2 glide vehicles carry through, detonating at sea close enough that shockwaves buckle piers and fracture support structures near submarines. Harbors flood under the concussive pressure. Docks sag, dragging crews into emergency maintenance as waves overrun shore facilities. Losses remain constrained, but recovery will cost valuable hours. Back in Washington's command suites, analysts trace the attack pattern in real time. The targets are carefully chosen: airfields, depots, docks. The goal is not random destruction, but to immobilize reinforcements, grounding aircraft, reducing fuel stores, interrupting logistics. Each repaired runway or warehouse consumes hours or days, shrinking options in tight operational windows. Timelines are the real weapon. But paralysis proves partial, not total. Guam suffers visible devastation, yet not every aircraft is destroyed, not every runway lost. Okinawa staggers, but operates with several runways intact. Hawaii endures damage, but major facilities remain serviceable. America's defensive structure bends under the barrage without shattering. The intended instant knockout transforms into a mosaic of victories and failures, a sobering warning shot, but not decisive collapse. For the sailors and airmen at the front, the psychological weight is evident. Hypersonic glide vehicles move with the irregularity of piloted craft, but without visible pilots, blurring conventional expectations of missile engagement. Screens flash trajectories that shift unpredictably, forcing operators to fire interceptors into probabilities rather than clear paths. Defense planners had long warned of the difficulty. Now sailors experience it firsthand. Rescue and recovery unfold simultaneously. Medics administer care across Guam's scorched airfield. Engineers divert from normal schedules to emergency patching of runways and safeguards for remaining depots. Across Hawaii's docks, repair teams weld fractured steel before floodwaters destabilize more piers. Communications, while strained, continue through redundancies rehearsed after earlier cyber conflict. America's command structure remains injured but communicative. relaying both verified losses and committed responses. Strategically, one message emerges unmistakably. Forward bases in the Pacific are within reach. Beijing has achieved proof of concept. Airfields armored for decades can be struck from afar. Even without full success, partial effects are heavy. US squadrons remain grounded at least temporarily, fuel reserves diminished, logistical pacing slowed. China's high command notes the mixed outcome privately. Celebrations for penetrated defenses accompany quiet recognition that America has not been silenced. Failure to annihilate Guam or Hawaii outright means retaliation remains not just possible, but imminent. Families across the Pacific, from towns in Guam to neighborhoods in Hawaii, see televised images of smoke rising from hangars and docks. Civilian panic deepens. Flames are no longer confined to speculation, but visible across news networks. Rumors outpace verifiable reports, shaping perceptions faster than military briefings. For those far from the Pacific theater, the reality of war becomes tangible overnight. Hour 3 closes with the Pacific smoldering. America absorbs the cost, but resilience lingers through layered defenses and improvised recovery. Beijing proves its hypersonics matter, but the absence of a clean knockout leaves the campaign's momentum unresolved. Forward defenses remain active, wounded yet operational. Meanwhile, planners on both sides grasp that disrupting supply chains and bases is not enough. Weapons delivered by missiles can weaken infrastructure, but they cannot by themselves guarantee permanent control of contested airspace. Another dimension of the conflict is already stirring. Machines built not just to strike, but to persist, to probe, and to overwhelm by presence rather than velocity. Hour 6, the drone swarm awakens. Hour 6, a new sound takes over the battlefield, not the crack of missiles or the roar of jets, but the steady buzz of engines rising into the air. Over the Taiwan Strait, mass waves of unmanned aircraft launch in carefully coordinated formations. Some skim just above the water like metallic fish. Others climb toward the clouds where radar coverage becomes patchy. Each carries a role. Some act as scouts, some as electronic decoys, others as direct strike platforms. This is not a handful of drones, but a deliberate attempt to overwhelm Taiwan's defenses through saturation. Publicly available accounts note that PLA testers have already experimented with launcher systems, firing between 48 and 200 drones in single events. On this scale, the intention is to expand those tests into operational salvos that make defenders struggle to distinguish real threats from the noise. Behind the large numbers lies coordination directed by artificial intelligence nodes within the Chinese system. Human commanders define objectives and boundaries, but the detailed execution, the choice to dodge left or right, to scatter or regroup, to jam or go silent, is left to the embedded AI software on board. Each drone adds to the collective, streaming data back while recalculating routes in seconds. It becomes a machine-directed maneuver battle, carried out at speeds no human pilot or controller can handle directly. Where radar locks might normally pin aircraft, the drones scatter into sudden, collective evasions. Where traditional air defenses manage small numbers at a time, these operators face entire waves shifting direction at once. Taiwanese defenders had anticipated saturation attempts. Crews man automatic gun batteries and missile platforms, opening fire as incoming groups light up radar scopes. Tracer rounds weave across the horizon, intersecting with the first formations. Surface-to-air missiles arc upward, detonating amid clusters, shredding dozens of intruders at a time. Yet as soon as gaps appear, the next clusters adapt. For every disruption, more drones angle in from behind, adjusting formations to press forward. Numbers begin exerting their own pressure. Defenders succeed in intercepts, but the flow never halts. Part of the strain comes not only from quantity, but from deliberate electronic warfare. Some drones scatter jamming signals that blur radar images into fields of static. Others tow reflectors to exaggerate their radar signatures, forcing Taiwanese screens to report bloated numbers or phantom objects. Operators quickly shift fire away from genuine threats, wasting ammunition while smaller strike drones slip closer. The overload combines physical challenge with cognitive one. Crews must decide what to engage in compressed seconds, while displays turn unreliable. Weapons intended to track conventional aircraft suddenly face saturation beyond their design philosophy. Amid this rising pressure, Taiwan activates its own unmanned complement. Loyal Wingmen-type drones, supplied through joint programs with the United States, roar into flight. Bigger and faster than the smaller strike drones, these systems act as force multipliers beside human-operated fighters. United States defense planners had also pushed concepts like Rapid Dragon, palletized munitions dropped from transport planes, and elements of that thinking now reach the battlefield. Taiwan relies on a modest fleet, not mass swarms, but quality helps offset quantity. Each carries advanced air-to-air missiles, electronic warfare pods, or sensors used to disrupt jammed frequencies. Indoctrinated under allied coordination software, they operate semi-independently, communicating as mini-groups able to flank incoming blocks and counter their maneuvers. This marks one of the first large-scale clashes where autonomous clusters oppose each other directly. Instead of coordinated radio calls from pilots, machines respond to relative movement alone. Chinese drones mass into compact groups, then surge as a single organism. Taiwan's Wingmen counter, slicing into the groupings with sudden bursts of speed, fracturing patterns deliberately crafted by PLA engineers. Both sides rely on algorithms updating in milliseconds. Human operators, meanwhile, shift into supervisory roles. Taiwanese pilots in cockpits largely designate general objectives, watching their wingmen execute precision interception faster than reflexes allow. Moment-to-moment combat belongs to the machines themselves. In the sky above the strait, battles unfold in dozens of micro-theaters simultaneously. Surveillance drones are torn apart by faster interceptors. Strike drones carrying explosives attempt dives against radar installations on the shoreline, only to be intercepted mid-descent. A few make it across the coastline, striking a supply warehouse and damaging portions of a radar array inland. The actual damage is modest, but the effect of constant harassment shapes perception. To civilians watching from concealed shelters, the sheer volume looks like a storm of synthetic attackers blotting the horizon. The role of manned aircraft diminishes quickly. Taiwanese fighter pilots contribute most by tasking their unmanned partners, not through traditional dogfighting. Few have time to line up visual shots. Instead, they authorize AI-driven intercept plans that execute themselves. For commanders, this shift signals a historic moment. Most air combat kills registered in this hour belong to unmanned platforms, not human-triggered shots. Aerospace warfare passes through a threshold where human oversight substitutes for control. Defensive batteries continue expending ammunition at unsustainable rates. Gun platforms rattle through belts of shells. Missile mounts exhaust their ready stores. Logistics crews rush reloads, but cannot keep pace with the tempo. The recognition sets in. What Taiwan faces is not a finite attack, but rather a renewable system able to generate sortie after sortie from continental staging hubs. For Chinese commanders, supply chains provide near-limitless pools. For Taiwan, replacement cycles hinge on finite stockpiles and allied deliveries. The balance of endurance becomes as vital as tactical engagement. Electronic disruption compounds the stress. Taiwanese radar crews witness entire banks of screens dissolve into forests of meaningless signatures. One battery ceases fire not because it was destroyed, but because software blindness leaves operators guessing. Technical teams work frantically to reset processing modules, but when software is contested dynamically, correction lags behind disruption. The contest increasingly takes place between algorithms rather than missiles. Code dismantling detection as much as munitions dismantle hardware. China's command centers witness progress, but not the breakthrough they aimed for. The intent had been to fatigue Taiwan's defense so completely that corridors would open for direct penetration of the western shore. Instead, progress stalls. Loyal wingmen combined with pre-positioned automated guns absorb more incoming firepower than planners expected. Many attacking drones perish before reaching the main island, snared in kill zones or swept down by coordinated defensive fire. The strait becomes peppered with fragments, plastic and metal frame pieces floating in the water among rising smoke. Pressure mounts, but decisive collapse never comes. For civilians hiding in basements and transit tunnels, the battle feels both near and distant. Distant, because most of the destruction is visible only as smoke and flashes above water. Near, because the reverberation of explosions shakes windows and echoes inside shelter walls. The realization spreads that machines now wage war directly overhead, with human populations primarily relegated to waiting underneath, uncertain of what breaches might eventually follow. By the 6th hour's end, both sides pause to assess. Taiwan still guards its coastline. Chinese drones display reach and persistence, but fail to clear a safe corridor. Commanders notice the trend. Losses are counted more in materiel than soldiers. The human casualty numbers remain relatively low. The industrial cost of shattered systems escalates by the minute. Analysts across capitals remark that the Russia-Ukraine war had already accelerated global fascination with drone combat, and here in East Asia, the concept now expands into full-scale swarm warfare. The PLA, like others, has invested deeply in both swarm capabilities and counter-swarm tech. The clash demonstrates ambitions, but also limitations. What unsettles observers most is how little human decisions seem to matter once the waves met. Objectives and boundaries were human, but execution, attack, defense, adaptation belonged to AI. The process left human participants as managers rather than direct warfighters. The outcome: no clear victor, but a battlefield transformed into debris fields of defeated machines. As commanders review the outcome, one looming thought enters their calculations. If aerial swarms cannot carve a passage, other means must follow. The question shifts from numbers destroyed to strategy. If the swarms cannot secure a corridor, what comes next? Hour 12, Taiwan under fire. Hour 12. By midday, the western coast of Taiwan is thick with smoke from hours of constant strikes. Drone waves and missile barrages have battered every element of the island's layered defenses, and the pattern grows unmistakable. China is pressing toward its amphibious stage. Large salvos keep crashing into Taiwan's southern ports at Kaohsiung and Tainan, targeting the island's ability to move fuel, ammunition, and materiel. What were once hubs for the global economy now stand under deliberate attack as Beijing searches for openings to soften the shoreline. Taiwanese planners had long expected this scenario. Defense concepts shaped by decades of study emphasized that the broad beaches of the west coast were vulnerable to assault. In preparation, engineers buried thick belts of coastal mines just offshore and layered automated gun platforms along the surfline. Hardened bunkers house crews tied into Patriot batteries that still intercept incoming fire, despite dwindling stocks. The defenses present a fortress-like obstacle, one built not only for passive resistance, but to impose grave costs on any vessel that dares to cross. CNA and CSIS studies stress that geography and Taiwan's hardened infrastructure make amphibious landings among the most punishing military operations anywhere. That reality is now visible. Every Chinese probe toward the shoreline runs into minefields or interlocking defense fire, stalling before troops can disembark. In Kaohsiung, Chinese strikes hit critical logistics nodes, damaging fuel facilities and disabling portions of the port. Smoke climbs across the skyline, blotting roads and slowing recovery crews. Naval patrol boats weave through narrow channels to reseed mines, preparing for amphibious moves that remain just over the horizon but have not yet committed. Overhead, surveillance drones continue to feed live imagery back to PLA command nodes, directing missile fire with precision against positions already mapped. Every blast destabilizes repairs and keeps defenders under relentless strain. Civilians endure the consequences in shelters and subway systems now pressed into service as emergency bunkers. Families bring suitcases packed with essentials, listening to ventilation hum against the pressure of nearby detonations. Power substations take additional damage, sending new blackouts across urban districts. With streets clogged and fuel stations damaged, Daily survival revolves around whatever stockpiles can be secured nearby. For Taiwan's citizens, the 12th hour is no longer about interruptions. It is about endurance under direct assault. Tainan faces a similar reality. Its port, designed for commerce, has become a lifeline for transporting military supplies inland, which makes it a priority target. Critical warehouses are destroyed, and storage tanks ignite, spilling fire across roads never intended for combat conditions. Fire brigades struggle through impassable debris. Though defenders contain some of the damage, gaps in supply lines appear. The result is not the collapse of Taiwan's logistics in a single day, but a measured constriction that forces commanders to make choices about which sectors to prioritize. At the waterline, Taiwan's coastal defenses prove their worth. Automated guns and missile batteries remain active, intercepting swathes of incoming drones. Unmanned underwater vehicles probing for mine gaps are detected and destroyed before clearing lanes. Amphibious ships wait far out of range, their commanders calculating whether heavy losses are acceptable or whether more bombardment is needed first. Beijing's planners envisioned breakthrough points by this hour, but the minefields and overlapping defenses enforce a brutal equation. Any premature landing would likely suffer catastrophic casualties. The rhythm becomes one of attrition. Taiwan's gun barrels glow from sustained fire, while Patriot batteries ration interceptors carefully. Engineers improvise, rerouting power across damaged grids or welding replacement parts from scavenged material. Each patch buys time and keeps defensive positions viable a little longer. On the Chinese side, fresh waves of drones and missiles launch across the strait in near-continuous salvos, underscoring Beijing's intent to grind defenses until one seam finally opens. Despite the intensity, the broader picture remains. No landing craft approach. Kaohsiung and Tainan are heavily damaged but not surrendered. Shorelines still hold active artillery, minefields remain intact, and bunkers preserve firing positions despite the wreckage surrounding them. For Beijing, every additional hour without progress risks bleeding away ammunition stockpiles and giving international reinforcements time to close in. Across Taiwan, citizens listen to radio broadcasts that highlight determination even as they acknowledge mounting losses. Ports once central to global trade lie crippled, with cranes toppled, rail spurs broken, and roads leading inland cratered by impact. Yet life does not grind to a stop. Allied staging points in Japan and the Philippines signal their intent to push limited resupply convoys toward Taiwan, escorted by naval forces prepared to counter new missile attacks. Supplies trickle through contested routes, not enough to restore comfort, but enough to prevent rapid collapse. The knowledge that outside support is trying to sustain them helps steady morale in shelters. For soldiers on the coast, exhaustion becomes a second enemy. Crews rotate through positions as fatigue mounts, sleeping in underground tunnels thick with smoke. Communications shift onto secure line-of-sight radios when data links cut out under heavy jamming. Still, each stalled drone wave reinforces discipline. Defenders know the prize for holding is survival itself. So long as no beachhead emerges, Taiwan remains unbroken. At Chinese headquarters, results look mixed. Satellite images confirm infrastructure burning, harbors clogged with debris, and people displaced from coastal cities. Yet there is no image of PLA soldiers disembarking in strength. Without an established corridor, every tactical victory risks waste. Extended bombardment begins to feel less like preparation for occupation and more like an expensive stalemate. American analysts reviewing satellite feeds note the effectiveness of Taiwan's layered defenses. Reports confirm the mine belts remain in place, surface batteries continue to function, and interceptors still fly despite heavy expenditures. Washington accelerates discussions with allies over resupply flows. Each drained ammunition stockpile or destroyed radar unit tilts the balance closer to a breakthrough for China. Reinforcement becomes not optional, but essential if Taiwan is to maintain resistance beyond the first day. Despite heavy damage, Taiwan still resists. The ports of Kaohsiung and Tainan, while scarred and partially disabled, are defended with enough force to deny Chinese control. Resupply is painful and slow, but not severed entirely, thanks to Allied escorts trying to preserve corridors. China's hope for a rapid landing zone fades as mid-afternoon turns to evening, and bombardment stretches on without decisive payoff. By the 12th hour, Taiwan is still sovereign, but the cost is visible everywhere. Fires raging across industrial districts, railway lines twisted skyward, and families pressed underground for safety. The humanitarian impact deepens by the minute, as much a crisis of survival as of defense. Beijing's leaders wanted a breach by now. Instead, they face the prospect of prolonged operations against an island willing to absorb punishment. And while guns continue trading fire across the strait, pressure is widening beyond the battlefield. The conflict is already spilling into other realms, where ports and runways are no longer the only targets. By the start of the next day, the weight of the contest will not just be measured in missiles and drones, but in the broader systems that tie nations together, and those systems are about to come under attack. Day 2. Economic war begins. Day 2. As the battle grinds on around Taiwan's shores, another theater opens, this one measured not in missiles or drones, but in cargo manifests, fuel shipments, and blocked accounts. The United States and its allies shift strategy. If China cannot be stopped decisively on the battlefield, then its ability to sustain the war will be eroded through economic pressure. Sanctions are announced in quick coordination with NATO, Japan, Australia, and partners across Asia. Allies move to coordinate sanctions, maritime interdictions, and insurance restrictions that severely slow or reroute Chinese trade. Cutting access to oil and semiconductor supply lines is a deliberate strategy. The research shows sanctions and interdictions can rapidly sap a high-tech war effort. Financial markets feel the first shock. New York and London exchanges suspend assets tied to major Chinese state-owned banks. This step, rarely attempted against a country of China's scale, triggers immediate turbulence. The yuan plunges. Foreign investors liquidate holdings in panic. But the sharper impact is not monetary alone, it is physical. Cargoes bound for allied ports are stalled. Rail routes into Europe contract under political pressure. Shipping insurers raise rates so high that vessels find themselves stuck at anchor, waiting for clearance that may never come. The arteries feeding Beijing's economy begin to clot, even if global coordination remains imperfect and uneven. Inside Taiwan, the focus shifts to the crown jewel of the global supply chain, semiconductors. For years, defense analysts have warned that advanced chips represent the single most concentrated strategic asset on Earth, powering everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems. With bombardments hammering Kaohsiung and Tainan, these fabrication plants take on existential value. Washington directs defensive perimeters around them, while Beijing contemplates whether to seize, sabotage, or continue to harass. Taiwan's Fabs are heavily defended and prioritized for Allied protection, making them politically and militarily difficult to seize without unacceptable escalation. Advanced chips are the limiting factor for modern missiles, guidance systems, and AI. A prolonged blockade or denial of advanced nodes degrades sophisticated military capability. Taiwanese engineers, escorted by soldiers, continue their work inside reinforced facilities. Rumors spread that Fabs have shifted their production toward military chips, secure communication processors, radar modules, and missile components. For the technicians, this transformation is stark. They no longer see themselves as employees of an industry, but as the guardians of a warfighting resource with direct consequences for survival. For China, the economic war becomes most acute at sea. US and allied navies begin choking key maritime routes in the Indian Ocean and Strait of Malacca. Tankers carrying crude oil and liquefied natural gas are intercepted, rerouted, or abandoned as contracts collapse under insurance and sanction pressure. Overland pipelines from Russia and Central Asia function, but they cannot scale to compensate. Energy flows slow dramatically. Reserves inside China had been stockpiled prior to conflict, but those stores are finite. Launching waves of missiles and aircraft devours fuel at rates magnitudes beyond peacetime projections. The countdown begins visibly. Every day of high-intensity combat eats into reserves without feasible replenishment. Markets across Asia amplify the crisis. Commodity indexes soar. Insurance companies withdraw entirely from lanes passing the South China Sea. Allied states like India and Southeast Asian nations brace for secondary shocks as shipping snarls batter their import balances. Recent research shows tariffs and embargo-style measures can have major economic effects in months, not years, and the dislocation is already visible. The disruptions ripple outward, but Washington judges that the long-term strain imposed on Beijing outweighs the collateral costs. Beijing scrambles for alternatives. Some tankers find routes through neutral states, but small shipments cannot meet broader demands. Covert efforts to bypass interdictions encounter U.S. surveillance and legal barriers in international courts. Commanders within the PLA are briefed that their forces are burning through energy faster than it can be replaced, and that sanctions are magnifying the challenge by blocking access to new technologies. Each projection highlights the same point. Unless China secures a decisive outcome quickly, its capacity to keep fighting will steadily decline. At high-level command sessions, Xi is presented with blunt updates. Amphibious landings remain stalls, Taiwanese defenses are bloodied but not broken, and now the global financial system is shifting against China. Reports confirm semiconductor fabs remain in operation under Allied guard rather than Chinese control. Energy shortages are no longer hypothetical, they are measurable and growing. The PLA may continue striking Taiwan, but the broader economic engine that fuels modern war is faltering under external constraint. Washington presses the advantage. Japan dispatches Coast Guard and naval patrols to guard chokepoints alongside carrier groups. Australia expands interdiction operations westward. NATO states freeze financial clearances for Chinese firms and coordinate export sanctions on advanced machinery. The aim is explicit. Military setbacks alone may not force Beijing to retreat, but an accelerated economic spiral could. Cutting fuel and access to semiconductors weakens the very tools Beijing relies on to wage war. Across China's major cities, civilians start noticing the squeeze. Fuel rationing intensifies, creating long waits at gas stations. Rolling shortages spread quietly through factories awaiting imported components. Household goods vanish from shelves without explanation. Official media reassures the public that reserves remain high, but the strain is visible in daily life. War is no longer a distant spectacle in Taiwan. It becomes a lived disruption in Beijing, Shanghai, and inland production hubs. Inside Taiwan, the semiconductor staff endure constant risks. Reconnaissance drones circle overhead, while missile impacts destroy infrastructure nearby. Still, Fabs hum with limited output. US intelligence and reconnaissance teams monitor closely, aware that these plants are both strategic assets and prime targets. Their survival shapes the tempo of war as much as any battle fought along the beaches. Every retained shipment of high-grade chips extends Allied capability. Every cut shipment strains Chinese systems more deeply. By late on the second day, the outlines of the economic conflict are clear. Sanctions, interdictions, and insurance barriers have not crushed Chinese trade fully, but they are degrading its flow at alarming speed. Energy imports are shrinking. Semiconductor access is pinned to Taiwan's survival. Financial markets have turned hostile. The countdown is not symbolic, it is numerical, tracked in reserve charts and fuel consumption logs. For military operations, the consequences are immediate. Fuel rationing forces command to weigh the cost of each major sortie. Missile launches draw from reserves that cannot be replaced at current import levels. Drone waves consume batteries and parts tied to semiconductor production, increasingly out of reach. The battlefield remains fierce, but the logistics behind it reveal a quiet erosion. What grows clearer to both sides is that direct force is no longer the only decisive lever. The economic war defines not only the pace, but the duration of China's campaign. Each day without a breakthrough puts its economy deeper into crisis, while reinforcing America's confidence that time and pressure work in its favor. As the second day closes, Beijing and Washington both recognize that deterrence has shifted once again. The ground war and the sea blockade remain active, but the framework of conflict now extends into domains once thought immune to direct combat. And already, planners see the lines extending further, not along seas or ports, but into arenas that orbit overhead, where vulnerabilities are just beginning to be tested. Day 3, space war escalates. Day 3. As the fighting continues across Taiwan and the Pacific, attention abruptly shifts skyward. The conflict moves into orbit. Chinese forces begin operations aimed at disrupting the satellites that serve as the backbone of US command, navigation, and surveillance. Early in the morning, launches rise from mobile sites inland and from modified aircraft. At the same time, ground-based stations direct powerful beams toward the heavens. The focus is clear: to degrade the satellites that keep US forces coordinated and precise. Without them, logistics falter, intercept timings drift, and deployments lose reliability. The first strikes targets smaller tracking satellites used to monitor Chinese naval movements. Rather than colliding directly, China employs kinetic anti-satellite interceptors and suspected co-orbital operations to disable systems. Monitors in US command centers suddenly watch live streams go dark as signals vanish. Screens that only hours earlier tracked fleets now display static. Simultaneously, directed jamming efforts disrupt encrypted communications flowing through orbit, leaving commanders with bursts of interference instead of clear updates. These effects are intermittent, not permanent, but they create enough confusion during critical moments to disrupt planning. Analysts had long debated whether a Taiwan conflict would extend into space. Theories published in recent years argued that it could not stay limited to Earth. Forecasts warned that GPS, missile synchronization, communications, and real-time surveillance were too central to US operations to be left untouched. By the morning of Day 3, those warnings turn real. 2 navigation satellites used to synchronize US missile intercepts flicker offline. Launch crews at Okinawa report hesitations in timing. Fractions of a second suddenly fall out of sync. In missile defense, such slippage can mean the difference between intercept and impact. At Space Force headquarters in Colorado, prearranged contingency plans begin. Rather than depending solely on legacy constellations, operators reroute traffic through sprawling networks of commercial satellites already in orbit. Constellations designed for global internet access, systems like Starlink and others, become emergency military assets. These satellites, hardened under new encryption packages, provide backup bandwidth and synchronization. Analysts remind commanders that commercial proliferation was built precisely for such resilience. Taking down a handful of satellites is disruptive, but removing thousands simultaneously is infeasible. Counterspace attacks can degrade specific services, but commercial backups limit how quickly either side can blind the other entirely. Still, resilience does not equal immunity. Reports arrive from destroyers and cruisers deployed near Guam. Guidance is not behaving as expected. Positioning once measured within meters now drifts by hundreds. Naval crews adjust calculations manually, slowing firing solutions in fast-moving engagements. Onshore, artillery units in Taiwan suffer from corrupted coordinates, shells landing far from intended impact zones. Fighter pilots trying to rely on autopilot navigation discover abrupt failures and have to switch to manual reference points. For those on the ground and in the air, the war in space feels immediate, manifesting as errors and hazards when seconds matter most. China, meanwhile, runs into unintended consequences. The anti-satellite operations generate new debris fields that spreads unpredictably. Fragments rush across orbits at thousands of meters per second, dangerous not only to American satellites, but also to commercial and scientific craft from neutral nations. Collision warning systems across Europe and Asia begin to sound alarms. Diplomatic complaints flood in, pointing out the risk of a cascading debris storm that could disable swathes of global communications infrastructure for years. Debris creation had been flagged as an inevitable outcome, but the practical fallout paints the costs clearly in real time. The PLA presses onward nonetheless. More jamming signals blanket low Earth orbit, aiming to blind optical sensors that provide high-resolution imagery of Chinese staging points on the mainland. In response, US engineers accelerate software improvisation. Civilian satellites are linked in new configurations, creating temporary constellations designed to mimic lost military ones. Engineers push rapid software patches into orbit, creating ad hoc solutions under immense time pressure. In essence, both sides are repurposing space assets never built for this kind of combat. Every day, the line between military and commercial platforms blurs further. Commanders privately admit the new reality. Even satellites not intended as weapons now play decisive roles. Civilian arrays used for rural internet now deliver encrypted signals for frontline units. Weather satellites redirect to provide cloud imagery over naval staging zones. Reconnaissance satellites once charting cars in city streets now track landing craft moving toward the Taiwan coast. The war expands without the need for fresh launches. It uses the billions invested in commercial constellations and turns them into contested tools of combat. Analyses show such proliferation inherently makes satellite systems more resilient. Losing a few weakens capability, but does not cripple it outright. By evening of the third day, results are mixed at best. Beijing claims success in destroying several US satellites outright and in disrupting critical GPS synchronization. Washington releases counter-statements, emphasizing that backup constellations have restored much of what was lost. Neither side controls orbit completely. Both operate under partial clarity. Both suffer periodic blind spots. The outcome is neither dominance nor collapse, only instability. Below, quieter disruptions accumulate outside of combat zones. Airlines shift routes after navigation errors appear in pre-flight checks. Maritime shipping captains report irregularities in automated course plotting. Civilian trains using GPS-timed switches revert to slower backup methods. In one terse line, what happens in orbit does not stay there. Civilian and commercial infrastructure across the globe feels the ripple effects. Military planners observe that the orbital campaigns mirror the dynamics at sea and in cyberspace, temporary advantage rather than decisive supremacy. Space operations offer one side short-lived edges, but also propagate hazards indiscriminately. Every missile launched against a satellite stirs debris that threatens friend and foe alike. Each jamming effort can disrupt hostile signals, but also risk blinding networks used universally. The theater is contested, but the battlefield is fragile. Inside Beijing, advisors caution that the hoped-for knockout of America's surveillance and guidance web has not materialized. Too many replacements and commercial satellites exist to erase functionality wholesale. The PLA has inflicted pain, but full blindness is beyond reach. In Washington, briefing officers highlight how resilience programs paid off, but they also note shortcomings. Replacements may fill gaps, yet missile interception demands near-perfect precision. Every clock drift increases the risk of a missed intercept. Gains, both sides realize, remain imperfect. By the third night, analysts conclude that the space front delivers confusion and instability more than clean victories. Both militaries still communicate, navigate, and strike, but at reduced efficiency. Counterspace campaigns can interrupt, degrade, and complicate, but they cannot eliminate capability outright. And every step upward into orbit generates collateral threats that neither Beijing nor Washington can fully control. Temporary advantage is possible, but the costs accumulate for everyone. As day 3 passes into night, planners note that the war has broadened yet again. Satellites burn, debris multiplies, and networks reroute under pressure. The ground battles grind forward, but the conflict is now multi-layered, stretching from coastal defenses to far above Earth. The Pacific is no longer the only horizon on which strategy turns. Another weight is about to enter the contest, pushing the balance of forces from an entirely different direction. Week 2, the AUKUS factor. Week 2. By the second week of war, the conflict is no longer concentrated in Taiwan's skies or coastal waters. A new southern axis takes shape, reshaping the map of the Pacific. Australia, once cautious in balancing its economic relationship with Beijing against its security commitments to Washington, now moves decisively. What had long been cast as a future-oriented pact, AUKUS, suddenly begins to matter in the present. Bases open fully to allied fleets. Reinforcements flow through Darwin and Perth, and the continent becomes the southern anchor of an allied perimeter that stretches north into Japan and east across the Pacific Isles. The most visible part of this move is not the sudden arrival of new Australian submarines. Those remain years away under AUKUS planning, but the use of Australian territory as a staging hub. Canberra accelerates integration measures, hosting US and British vessels and aircraft while pushing forward command and control cooperation. Future nuclear-powered submarines promised under the pact remain a long-term program, but Allied basing and intelligence sharing extend Allied reach immediately. For Beijing, the signal is stark. The southern flank, once distant, is now contested in ways that threaten its lifelines. China's leaders rely heavily on waterways that stretch through the South China Sea and down into the Strait of Malacca. Energy carriers, bulk raw materials, and commercial supplies travel along these routes in vast quantities. With Japan and US bases pressuring the north, Australia hosting allied fleets to the south, and Indian Ocean patrols tightening further west, those lanes begin to show signs of encirclement. It is not yet a complete blockade, but each convoy now requires thicker escorts, and each trade mission exposes Beijing's ships to the risk of tracking by opponents trained in anti-submarine warfare. AUKUS itself had always been more than shipbuilding. Under stress of war, its architecture matures faster than expected. Shared systems fuse data from American destroyers, British frigates, and Australian patrol craft into common operational pictures. An Australian aircrew scanning the Indian Ocean can relay detections directly to a British frigate, whose reports are synchronized with a US submarine sonar. For sailors, the effect is profound. Vessels from three nations begin to operate as parts of a unified force rather than separate fleets. Exercises and planning turn into operational reality under crisis. In Darwin, ports transform rapidly. Convoys arrive with fuel, weapons, maintenance teams, and surveillance drones, cycling through for resupply. Local airstrips take heavier traffic, with Allied bombers and maritime patrol aircraft rotating in. Civilians see unprecedented deployments on their soil, not abstract announcements of future cooperation, but visible formations of Allied firepower. Perth, too, becomes a logistics anchor, linking the Indian and Pacific Ocean theaters. To commanders in Washington, this southern network compresses reinforcement routes and gives Allied fleets persistence they lacked in earlier decades. For Beijing, however, this creates calculation problems. Every vessel diverted to protect supply runs in the south is a vessel unavailable to support operations near Taiwan. Each tanker now risks interception, each container ship risks prolonged diversions. Though no absolute chokehold exists, the burden of maintaining escorts grows week by week. Chinese submarines continue to threaten contested waters, but they increasingly face adversaries deploying advanced sonar from Australian coasts and flying continuous patrols in the air. Stealth no longer guarantees safety. Research into AUKUS had highlighted its secondary function, interoperability and intelligence sharing. That shift now proves central. AI-driven systems translate sensor data into standardized formats, allowing quick collaboration across navies. This integration complicates Chinese attempts to strike piecemeal. An attack on one Allied vessel risks coordinated retaliation from others. Anti-submarine warfare becomes the most immediate battleground of this phase. Listening arrays stretch southward, while British and American aircraft draw on Australian basing to mount overlapping patrol circuits. The undersea dimension, once Beijing's best chance to operate quietly, becomes heavily contested. Economic pressure from these military moves adds a second layer. With southern waters observed and interdiction increased, shipping companies withdraw from exposed routes. Insurance spikes to prohibitive levels for vessels entering the South China Sea. Some Chinese trade adapts by rerouting through land corridors from Central Asia and Russia, but those flows cannot compensate for the capacity lost at sea. The southern axis does not cut supplies entirely, but amplifies the costs already rising from sanctions and blockades further west. Each week of disruption compounds losses for Beijing's war economy. In Taiwan, the shift is subtle but felt. Supplies that once trickled through long, vulnerable crossings now arrive more steadily. Replacement parts for air defense batteries, fresh munitions for artillery, and humanitarian goods come via allied convoys staged from Australian ports. For Taiwanese civilians enduring blackout conditions and bombardments, news of these routes helps morale. For their defenders, it means relief that the arsenal can be resupplied, not only drained. The southern flank offers a lifeline that blunts the pressure of continuous strikes. By the 14th day, intelligence assessments in Beijing warn that strategic options are narrowing. Amphibious assaults remain stalled. Missile inventories stay large but unreplenished, with supply lines ground down by interdiction. The southern net has not closed completely, but it has reshaped the strategic geography of the war. Encirclement is no longer a hypothetical. It is a trend line pointing toward isolation if left unchecked. Leaders face the dilemma of stretching outward to disrupt the perimeter and risking exposure, or contracting defensively and conceding initiative. In command posts across Canberra, London, and Washington, the sense of momentum builds. What began as an abstract defense agreement is now a live operational framework shaping a major power war. The implications for Beijing are clear. The loops of surveillance, coordination, and interdiction are drawing closer. Allied presence does not guarantee victory, but it curtails Beijing's freedom of navigation and stretches its naval forces thin. And so, by the close of the second week, a different kind of pressure shapes the horizon. The fight no longer depends only on missiles, drones, or amphibious troops. It also rests on endurance within tightening networks of surveillance and interdiction. For China, the strategic problem compounds daily, sustaining military momentum while logistical arteries constrict. The war has already accelerated conversations about economics, sea lanes, and alliances. But as week 2 concludes, allied integration creates a new dimension Beijing cannot ignore. If the southern net cannot be broken, the horizon narrows. The next phase of the conflict will not be decided solely on geography or trade routes, but through tools already directing battlefield choices in milliseconds, tools that are beginning to wrest control of decision-making from the very commanders who deploy them. Month 1. AI versus AI. Month 1. By the first month of the war, the rhythm of combat has shifted far from the patterns described in past conflicts. Decision-making at sea is no longer dominated by admirals issuing orders in real time, but by predictive systems running inside secure servers. When fleets engage across the Pacific, the sequence is familiar. Ships maneuver into position, drones deploy, missile tubes ready their payloads. What happens after that, however, unfolds faster than any human chain of command can cope with. Algorithms, trained on countless simulations and updated constantly with new sensor data, begin to manage the tempo within carefully delegated bounds. On the American side, much of this responsibility falls to systems developed under Project Maven. Originally designed to help classify surveillance data and highlight threats for human review, it has since expanded into a predictive combat tool. In secure networks linking ships, bases, and satellites, Maven processes radar sweeps, infrared signatures, intercepted communications, and telemetry from deployed drones. From this, it recommends reallocations and countermaneuvers seconds earlier than a human team could confirm them. Even a marginal gain, recognizing a flight path shift 10 seconds before it materializes, can decide the outcome of an engagement. Human operators issue objectives and confirm parameters, but inside those bounds, the AI adjusts posture faster than officers can issue spoken orders. China has nurtured systems pursuing the same goal. Its decades of investment in machine learning now produce combat models that weigh sensor data, and project enemy choices in near real time. These models are not permitted to act without constraint, but they can recommend trade-offs that once required long human deliberation. If projections show that committing several drones at high risk allows a missile a clearer path to strike a destroyer, the recommendation enters the battle map instantly. Human commanders provide thresholds and rules of engagement, but the software is tasked with balancing risk within those boundaries. To sailors watching these moves unfold, it often feels as though command has been preempted, not replaced, but accelerated beyond human pace. As the month unfolds, this logic produces battles that look very different from the naval clashes of the 20th century. Carrier groups advance cautiously, but the moment fleets close within strike range, predictive systems take over the micro-movements. Ships quietly shift bearings or alter speed by fractions in anticipation of projected enemy fire. Defensive missile turrets adjust autonomously in small increments, orienting not toward current trajectories, but toward anticipated ones seconds into the future. Drone patrols receive adjusted flight plans as their algorithms anticipate rival swarms adapting in turn. To outside observers, the clash seems less like traditional maneuvers and more like layers of mathematical models interacting across the ocean. The results are often difficult for crews to process. After-action reports show deployments in which assets had shifted roles with minimal explanation given at the time. One drone carrier moved abruptly out of position, exposing itself to attack. Logs later showed that predictive models had determined higher-value units could be defended by letting it act as a decoy. Crews sometimes discover too late that their actions reflected algorithmic weighting of probabilities, not human judgment on morale or symbolism. Commanders maintain override authority, but in the pulse of combat, these decisions come through before staff can finish deliberation. For those serving at the tactical edge, the sensation is disorienting. Instructions arrive rapidly, but the reasoning often remains opaque. A gun battery might fire multiple intercepts at a target, only to ignore another that visually seems more threatening. Later review shows that the system had flagged the ignored threat as statistically unlikely to succeed, leaving it deprioritized. Combat officers find themselves authorizing orders already executed, wary of resisting changes that reflect a broader operational picture inaccessible to them. Officially, humans stay in the loop. Practically, the system mediates choices so quickly that disobedience feels like substituting instinct against a machine's aggregated view of the battlefield. Battles now unfold in compressed pulses. At one moment, predictive engines on the Chinese side concentrate drones for a push. Within seconds, Maven recalculates and orders a defensive posture across American ships positioned miles apart. A counterstrike surges automatically, not from an admiral's late call, but from a statistical model judging exhaustion in opposing defenses. Exchanges last minutes, but consume dozens of vessels and uncrewed systems, traded away in balanced calculations rather than daring hunches. Debris fields spread across the sea as the product of mathematical trade-offs rather than dramatic blunders. Both sides discover new strengths and new fragilities in this mode of war. Efficiency rises as algorithms optimize asset use, but so does unpredictability. Predictable loops of anticipation emerge. One side adjusts, the other counters, and formations return to near starting positions because projections cancel each other out. More troubling are the edge cases. A misclassified input, an overlooked anomaly, or a sheer software error can have severe consequences. In one clash, misinterpreted satellite data led the US system to assume Chinese sensors were blind. A deployment shifted forward to exploit the presumed gap, only to find enemy weapons fully aware and ready. What would once be called a commander's misjudgment turned out to be a machine's misread. Analysts warned months before the conflict that prediction model errors could trigger dangerous miscalculations, and now commanders find those warnings justified. These breakdowns remind both militaries that machine logic is not infallible. Reports circulate describing how model misinterpretations in simulations had already produced catastrophic outcomes, and real combat now bears this out. The data-driven confidence of prediction engines can conceal fragility, leaving crews exposed in ways only visible afterward. Lessons accumulate quickly, yet reliance persists, because abandoning the systems would concede reaction speed to the opponent's algorithms. The result is a paradox. Commanders distrust certain outputs even as they rely on them for survival. For soldiers and sailors, this new reality brings a psychological burden. The traditional sense of agency, acting decisively with fellow crew, wanes. Survival often seems to hinge less on quick decision-making than on whether their side's prediction engine happened to outpace its rival in the right moment. Officers describe feeling like couriers for conclusions already executed. Orders filter down, but the battle appears to work itself out above them, dictated by rival codes tens of layers deep. Leadership in Washington and Beijing continue to declare that humans remain in control, directing overall objectives and approving strategic aims. Formally, this remains true. Strategic directives, alliance decisions, and political limits are human instructions. But at the tactical level, the tempo of missiles in flight and drones weaving patterns across the sea, much of combat is mediated by algorithms. Tactical control flows through code, creating the impression for many that machines now frame outcomes in real time. By the end of the first month, one conclusion dominates internal assessments. Even if strategic direction stays human, the day-to-day exchange of fire is fundamentally algorithmic. Decisions about which drones to risk, which ships to reposition, and which salvos to launch are filtered through predictive systems that compress seconds into judgments. That shift creates vulnerabilities as much as advantages, introducing constant fear that a technical error could erase entire units without warning. It also raises deeper doubts for officers and crews. If their sacrifices result from equations rather than command judgment, whose war are they truly fighting? And as the second month approaches, a new problem emerges. Speed and probability may shape tactics at sea, but sustaining the fight depends on something else entirely: the continuous flow of the materials that make these algorithms and weapons work. Already, quiet vulnerabilities are showing in the supply chains that underwrite the entire contest. Month 2, Semiconductor Siege. Month 2. By the second month of fighting, the contest is defined less by missiles slamming into ports and more by the gradual erosion of the technology holding each arsenal together. A quieter threat begins to dominate every calculation: the availability of advanced semiconductors. The RAND and CEPR assessments had long warned that Taiwan's advanced Fabs produce the most cutting-edge nodes powering missile guidance, artificial intelligence, and hypersonic control, and that denying them would steadily erode modern military capacity. By now, the battlefield proves that warning accurate. China feels the constraint first. For years, its government invested heavily in domestic semiconductor capacity, but the manufacturing of the hardest nodes, those below advanced thresholds, and the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines needed to make them remain concentrated offshore. These capabilities cannot be replicated quickly. Missile strikes against Kaohsiung and Tainan have damaged surrounding infrastructure, but the core fabrication facilities continue to function under Allied protection. These Fabs are not immune, but their survival is heavily prioritized, guarded by air defense systems and reinforced shelters. For Beijing, directly targeting them is politically and militarily risky. It invites escalation that could destroy the very prize they need to control. The strain becomes visible in the weapons deployed at the front. Each hypersonic missile consumes advanced chips that regulate guidance and airflow modules. Each time a swarm of drones takes flight, it burns through processors optimized for coordination and navigation. Stockpiles built up before the war begin to dwindle by week 8. Maintenance crews report failing subsystems that cannot be replaced quickly. To compensate, parts are cannibalized, damaged weapons stripped for components to keep others online. But the process is finite. By the second month, Beijing faces the reality that it cannot launch unlimited waves of its most advanced weapons. Drone shortages follow the same pattern. At the start of the conflict, mass swarms had pressed Taiwan's defense to its edge. Now their frequency diminishes. Coordination algorithms still run, but fewer drones arrive at the front, and casualties in the air cannot be replenished quickly. Pilots note that American formations seem to hold longer, and Taiwanese defenders observe that interception rates are higher because incoming attacks are smaller and less synchronized. What looked like an unending tide during the first week diminishes into sporadic waves. America, meanwhile, scrambles to buttress its own semiconductor lifeline. The United States cannot fabricate the most advanced chips at home, but alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Europe provide partial relief. Japan and South Korea divert some capacity toward military orders. ASML in the Netherlands continues to channel the precision machines essential for advanced lithography to allied partners. The flow does not match peacetime demand. Consumer sectors in the US and allied economies experience sharp shortages, but defense industries receive enough shipments to sustain combat output. Radars continue to function. Interceptors can still launch. New drones reach frontline units, although in smaller batches than war planners once intended. The disparity grows sharper as time passes. Analysts track the declining pace of Chinese barrages, contrasting it with a still steady, if limited, US military supply pipeline. At first, the reduced tempo seems tactical, but intercepted PLA communications reveal the truth. Munitions are being conserved. Chinese commanders reserve advanced strikes for moments of strategic necessity. Salvos arrive spaced and measured, not because objectives have changed, but because the chips required to build them are finite. The global economy collapses under the same weight. Electronics factories in Europe postpone shipments. Automakers across Asia and the West cut production lines for lack of processors. Agricultural equipment sits unfinished in warehouses. Supply chains built across decades disintegrate within weeks when Taiwan's exports shrink. Economies far beyond the battlefield discover the war's bite every time a shipment fails to arrive. Inside Taiwan's Fabs, engineers endure the siege like soldiers in a bunker. They work under rolling blackouts, often sleeping on-site, sheltered by air defenses and reinforced walls. Their mission is no longer market delivery. It is survival and contribution to national defense. Every silicon wafer manufactured is treated as a strategic resource, fueling an arsenal. The staff understand that their labor now shapes not just Taiwan's economy, but the course of the war itself. Beijing attempts to alleviate this by drawing on partners. Russian assistance arrives, as do supplies from smaller states within its network. But these stopgaps cannot deliver advanced nodes. They provide bulk processors suitable for radios or simpler machinery, but not the high-end designs demanded by hypersonics, stealth avionics, or autonomous coordination. Research analyses consistently emphasize advanced fabrication capability is the product of decades of accumulated tools and knowledge, and it cannot be substituted quickly. Accessing this capacity requires machinery that China cannot yet build and that partners cannot provide. The result is visible at the front. Missile barrages rely more on older variants, slower and more predictable. Drone formations appear in smaller clusters, their precision dulled. US pilots report more intercepts, and allied naval crews note that the scale of incoming attacks has fallen. The imbalance becomes tangible. Mere survival is shifting into endurance, where the question is not whether American systems can intercept, but how long China can sustain a high-tech war under semiconductor famine. Messaging within Washington turns this into a political weapon. Leaders stress to allies that sanctions and interdiction are degrading Beijing's arsenal directly. Television clips and intelligence briefings highlight Chinese barrages tapering off. Public statements emphasize that advanced weapons require advanced chips and that supply chains are more decisive than fleet counts. NATO partners, India and middle powers, begin recalibrating their expectations. China's aura of unbreakable escalation begins to falter. Behind closed doors, America frames semiconductors as the oil of the 21st century. Whoever controls the stream controls the outcome. China's leadership feels the frustration. Advisors warn Xi that stockpiles are collapsing too quickly. Drone waves cannot be rebuilt at pace. Missiles held in reserve must be used sparingly. The irony is not lost. After decades of building the world's largest standing force and one of the largest navies afloat, Beijing now faces the reality that the engines driving its advanced arsenal depend on chips from an island it cannot seize intact. To press forward risks, destroying the very facilities it covets. By the end of the second month, numbers are stark. Projections inside NATO and RAND-aligned research firms chart dramatic reductions in China's advanced capacity if access to Fabs remains blocked. Chinese arsenals look increasingly finite, their replacement rate collapsing. America and its allies, though strained, retain replenishment. For Beijing, it is an existential dilemma. Either find a way to break the blockade or fight on with dwindling stocks that cannot be refilled. The conclusion resonates far beyond the battlefield. Soldiers notice fewer drones engaging them. Missile barrages grow lighter. Engineers in Taiwan treat every etched wafer as a survival act. Civilians across the globe live with electronics shortages stemming from the same crisis. Power in the Pacific no longer hinges only on carrier fleets or amphibious assaults. It is decided by the resilience of a few facilities and the global networks surrounding them. By the time the war reaches month 2, one lesson is unmistakable. The semiconductor siege dictates the pace, the firepower, and the endurance of the conflict. China's arsenal can still strike, but every missile fired is a reminder of scarcity rather than abundance. The question confronting commanders in Beijing is not when victory comes, but how long they can continue fighting without the chips that make their weapons function. And as the third month approaches, the growing shortages set the stage for something else. A phase where exhaustion, attrition, and escalating risks begin to weigh more heavily than any single blockade or strike. Month 3, breaking point. Month 3. The third month of fighting marks a shift from rapid strikes to attrition on both sides. Taiwan endures heavy destruction but continues to resist. Its western coastlines are scarred by bombardment, yet defensive belts of mines, hardened bunkers, and mobile artillery still block large-scale amphibious gains. Civilians live almost permanently underground. Coastal towns look less like functioning cities than improvised fortresses, patching together damaged grids while fending off small-scale assaults. For China's commanders, what had been envisioned as a swift landing campaign is instead a grinding war of position. Each attempt to push men and machines ashore comes at immense cost. Landing craft drift into minefields, crews disembark only to be pounded by artillery and airstrikes, and temporary footholds collapse before supply lines can be secured. China's bid for air supremacy fares no better. Initial missile strikes back in the first weeks damaged ports and airfields, but those losses have since been patched or bypassed. Coordinated US and Taiwanese aircraft now dominate much of the sky, supported by drones and surveillance drawn from allied networks. Each Chinese sortie sent in support of coastal assaults faces interception by advanced patrol formations. Losses of aircraft and pilots accelerate faster than replacement. By the start of the third month, China's squadrons struggle to project strength beyond their own staging zones on the mainland. The skies above Taiwan tilt increasingly toward defenders, leaving PLA forces vulnerable to strikes the moment they leave protective cover. Denied quick victory on beaches or in the air, Beijing leans heavily on its undersea fleet. Submarines disperse across the Pacific, tasked with clawing symbolic victories against American forces. In one of the largest submerged operations yet, Chinese boats fan out near Guam, the Philippine Sea, and across southern approaches. The gamble pays off in part. 2 US carriers are hit and lost in separate encounters, fireballs lighting the horizon and jolting American morale. The episode reminds Washington that even under strain, Chinese submarines remain lethal. Yet the cost proves enormous. Dozens of subs sortie, many never return. American destroyers, long-range maritime patrol aircraft from Japan and Australia, and acoustic nets linked to AUKUS bases track and hammer retreating vessels. Each success against a US carrier extracts a crippling toll of experienced crews and irreplaceable hulls. The PLA Navy's submarine force, built over decades of investment, bleeds strength that cannot be replenished quickly. What looks to Beijing like a badly needed blow at American prestige becomes, in practice, a trade China can ill afford. Few among the leadership celebrate when the ledger is tallied. Inside the Politburo and Central Military Commission, pressure intensifies. Reports detail amphibious losses, air failures, dwindling missile reserves, and submarine attrition. Drone warfare has already been throttled by semiconductor shortages. Advisors warn that without a breakthrough, China risks negotiating from weakness. Reluctance to speak of retreat directly leads instead to talk of escalation. Some hawkish officials raise options rarely discussed publicly. Internal debates reportedly include cyberattacks aimed at mainland America. Unlike prior efforts targeting Guam or Hawaii, these would attempt to disrupt U.S. civilian life directly, power grids, communication systems, or banking networks supporting war finance. The rationale: force Washington to divert attention inward, stretching defenses thin. Yet even advocates admit the risks. Background research highlights that resilience has steadily improved since earlier global cyber incidents. US grids now integrate greater redundancy, layered backups route through commercial satellites, and control nodes are dispersed. Severe disruption could occur, but widespread collapse of American society remains unlikely. Analysts caution the move could expose Chinese cyber units without yielding decisive gains, provoking retaliation rather than changing strategic balance. Other planners whisper about nuclear use, not city attacks, but limited tactical strikes against hardened military sites or even open-sea demonstrations. Maps highlight possible target zones. Casualty estimates appear in restricted briefings. The intended logic mirrors Cold War escalate to de-escalate scenarios, shock the adversary into negotiation by crossing a nuclear threshold at small scale. These proposals surface mainly in worst-case planning sessions rather than formal orders. Analysts stress that such a threshold remains extraordinarily dangerous, not only militarily but politically. International consensus, shaped over decades, still treats nuclear use of any kind as near certain to provoke devastating reprisal. Research reinforces this restraint. Any strike, demonstration, or tactical would almost certainly trigger massive US and allied retaliation, ranging from conventional annihilation of PLA assets to expansion towards strategic nuclear exchange. Xi's closest advisors weigh these proposals but understand their implications. The nuclear arsenal is real, but employment would court disaster. Intelligence indicates that Washington has signaled privately and publicly. Any nuclear detonation would draw overwhelming response. China may possess hundreds of warheads, but its capacity to absorb a full US counterstrike is questionable, and even allies like Russia are unlikely to condone escalation that destabilizes the entire global order. For China's leadership, the option remains technically possible, but strategically self-defeating. As weeks pass, these extreme possibilities stay theoretical. Preparations are simulated, command nodes tested, cyber units repositioned, but none are triggered. The risks are simply too great. Advisors recognize that pressing forward would risk uncontrollable consequences. Analysts tracking these debates note that deterrence itself, built through decades of signaling and posture, serves as the central brake. The threat of uncontrollable escalation makes nuclear use improbable, even in dire circumstances. Cyber escalation remains more plausible, but also faces sharply diminishing returns against hardened adversaries. In parallel, Washington intercepts fragments of these deliberations. Intelligence briefs hint that China is exploring extreme contingencies. The Pentagon relays warnings across regional commands, raising alerts in case escalation signals shift from planning to execution. Still, no red lines are crossed. Decision-making in Beijing remains constrained by the same calculus shaping Washington's judgment. Both sides understand that moving beyond conventional war risks catastrophe, not victory. Meanwhile, the conflict on the ground continues with grim perseverance. Taiwanese defenders rotate exhausted units through underground shelter networks. Allied supplies reach them in limited convoys, keeping their defenses functional if strained. American fleets recover from their carrier losses, maintaining presence with reinforced escorts and layered missile defenses. PLA Amphibious pushes remain bloody and fruitless. For those on the front lines, exhaustion defines daily life. Soldiers in Taiwan see burned coastal towns but still wave their flag. Naval crews patrol seas thick with wreckage. Chinese infantry, battered and undersupplied, cling to shattered footholds that collapse as American air power returns overhead. For civilians across Asia, the war is felt in shortages, blackouts, and commerce shockwaves. The visible reminder that the war's center is technological logistics rather than sheer numbers of troops. By the end of the third month, the conflict teeters. Advisors in Beijing still raise frightening contingencies, but research-backed analysis affirms their improbability because of overwhelming deterrence dynamics. Analysts across capitals conclude that neither Chinese leaders nor American ones desire escalation beyond control. Deterrence remains the central brake, holding the line against a slide into catastrophe. The war is not decided. It grinds forward, every engagement shaped less by territory seized than by the systems sustaining arsenals and the ability of leaders to weigh risks against survival. The third month closes not with resolution, but with exhausted adversaries circled by the same realization. Brute force is proving insufficient. What matters increasingly are the forces behind the combat, supply resilience, technological infrastructure, and the algorithms managing the fight. From here, the contest hinges on whether those unseen factors decide outcomes before commanders can. Wars in this century are defined less by territory seized than by control over technology and endurance under strain. Supply chains, semiconductors, energy access, and resilient networks now shape outcomes as much as tanks, ships, or planes. A fleet with no fuel cannot sail, and precision weapons without chips cannot fire. The background analysis shows that alliances and industrial resilience, not just battlefield victories, are decisive in 21st century conflict. If this scenario convinced you that tech and logistics matter as much as tactics, leave a comment with which domain you think decides modern wars: cyber, space, or chips. So if the test is endurance under technological pressure, which side is better prepared to outlast it? Tell us what you think.